Hello everyone, welcome to this video. So as the PMP exam is all set to transition from its current PMBOK 7th edition to the PMBOK 8th edition in July this year, I know many of you will be trying to clear the exam within the next 3 to 4 months. And on the other hand, some of you might be thinking of waiting until July 2026 to take the exam in its new format, which is perfectly fine as well. Now, to help both of you manage this transition smoothly, I will be doing some bonus PMP exam questions and answers practice sessions like these over the next few months. And the intent of these sessions would be to practice the types of questions common within the exam syllabus, both for the current format of the exam and the new format of the exam. Because, believe it or not, even with this new transition, about 70 to 80% of the PMP exam syllabus will still stay the same. So regardless of whether you plan to write the PMBOK 7th edition or let's say the PMBOK 8th edition of the exam, these practice sessions, in addition to my regular monthly Q&A sessions, are going to help you prepare for the PMP exam with the right mindset. So 5 questions common across both the PMBOK 7 and the PMBOK 8 syllabus. Let's get started. Right, so question number 1, guys, pause the video, read the question and try to answer it before we solve it together, okay? So the drill will remain the same as the previous month's Q&A sessions, okay? Right, so let's get started. During a project status review meeting, the quality manager requests for a new upgrade to the product packaging, okay? So note that it's a new request for an upgrade, okay? To which document should the project manager refer to find out who has the authority to approve this change request, okay? So the quality manager has put forward a new upgrade request to the product packaging, and now the project manager needs to find out that who has the authority to approve this change request, okay? So let's look at the options A, B, C and D and evaluate them one by one, okay? And while doing that, we'll keep the positive bias principle as we have learned in this video in our mind, okay? And that means that we'll not reject any option without solid reasoning, okay? So we'll always have a positive bias of keeping all the options on the table till we have a solid reason to reject that option, okay? So let's evaluate the options one by one. Option A, requirements traceability matrix, okay? Now this is incorrect, guys, right? Because requirement traceability matrix is generally used in the scope definition process, right? So when you are defining the scope of a project, you collect the requirements from the various sources, and that matrix of requirement traceability gives you the relationship between a scope item versus the source from where the source has been requested for, okay? So in that sense, this has nothing to do with providing any authority for any change request approvals, okay? So option A is incorrect. Option B, RACI matrix, okay? So if you know about RACI matrix, so it's a matrix which talks about how tasks will be allocated in a project, okay? So R is the responsible person, A is the approver, C is the person who you need to consult with, and I is the person whom you need to keep informed, okay? So please go ahead and study RACI matrix from your PMBOK 7th edition or the process group practice guide, okay? So it's very important for your PMP exam. Now you might say that as per the scenario of this question, the RACI matrix can be a potential option because in this matrix, you'll be able to find the person who is responsible for approving the change request, who needs to be consulted while approving the change request, who needs to be kept informed while approving the change request. So this might be a potential option, okay? So let's hold this for a while. Option C, change management plan, okay? So very important. So this change management plan is developed during the planning process of a project, okay? And this change management plan talks about how changes will be managed across the entire life cycle of the project. Who will approve the change, how the changes will be documented, how the changes will be evaluated, etc., etc. Okay, so the entire plan of managing a change is captured in the change management plan. So this is also a potential option to find out who has the final authority to approve the change request. Okay, So let's hold this option for now as well. Okay. Note that how we are not rejecting any option without any solid grounds. Okay. So as of now, we don't have a solid ground yet to reject an option between option B and option C. Okay, let's look at option D, change log. That is incorrect, right? Because in change log, you basically keep a track of a change request from the time it has been proposed till the time it has reached a decision, whether it's accepted, whether it's rejected, whether it's put on hold, etc., right? So the change log is basically a ready reckoner where you can go to access information in terms of the status of a change request. Okay, but here it is definitely not giving you the information in terms of who will have the authority to approve a change request. So option D is of course incorrect. So I hope none of you have selected between option A and option D. Okay, now let's closely evaluate option B. Okay, now if you see RACI matrix, guys, what is this? This is a tool, right? This is a tool for task allocation. So for example, whenever there is a task which comes out of a project meeting or a project status review meeting, etc., what you do is you use RACI matrix to allocate a task. Okay, and while allocating that, you document that who will be the person who will be responsible for it, who is the person who will be approving it, who is the person who will be contributing to it, and who is the person who needs to be kept informed. Okay, so note that RACI matrix is a tool which is used for task allocation. It is not used as a tool to decide escalation matrices or to decide approval chains. Okay, so when it comes to change request and when it comes to finding that who needs to approve a change request, so for example, let's say any change request less than $5,000 can be approved by the project manager himself. Any change request between $5,000 to $50,000 needs to be approved by the project sponsor. Let's say any change request more than $50,000 needs to be approved by the program office or the project office, etc. Okay, so everything is captured in the change management plan. Okay, so the correct answer to this question is option C, which is the change management plan. RACI matrix is a very close choice, but a incorrect answer choice, guys. Okay, and also note that, guys, the question is asking here that to which document should the project manager refer to. Okay, so when it's talking about document, it's basically talking about a project artifact. Okay, it's not talking about a tool or a technique. Okay, so change management plan is a project artifact. RACI matrix is not a project artifact or a project document. It's a tool or technique for task allocation or responsibility allocation. Okay, so from that angle as well, this answer choice is also incorrect. Now in your PMP exam, please be aware of such close answer choices. Okay, you'll be time and again tested on your understanding in terms of such close answer choices, and there you need to have a solid foundational knowledge to decide between the right answer and the very close wrong answer choice. Okay, so RACI matrix here is a very close wrong answer choice, and the correct answer to this question is option C, which is the change management plan. So question number 2, guys, pause the video, read the question properly and try to answer it before moving forward. Okay, so we'll start solving the question. So during a daily stand-up meeting, so now you know what are stand-up meetings and what are discussed during a stand-up meeting. Several unforeseen impediments have been highlighted by the Agile team. Okay, good. This is related to a legal approval that has now become mandatory after a new legislation has been passed by the government. Okay, so this risk was not preempted before, but it's happening now. You as the project manager now need to assess the impact of this impediment. Which parameter is likely to be ranked highest in your risk impact analysis or RPN score? Now, RPN is an important terminology, guys. This means risk priority number. Okay, so you need to get used to these kind of acronyms which are very common in the PMBOK terminologies. Okay, so the question is asking that which parameter among these 4 options A, B, C and D is likely to be ranked highest in your risk impact analysis. So let's start evaluating the options. Okay, manageability. Okay, possible. You can reason that yes, managing a risk is important. So if you want to rate it from 0 to 5, you may rate it like 4 or 5. It's important. I understand that. We'll hold this option. Option B, connectivity. So connectivity essentially means impact analysis. So you need to understand that whenever a risk is occurring, how it is connected to your scope, how it is connected to your schedule, how it is connected to your cost, how is it connected to your resources. So if you are changing a variable, what other variables of your project it's impacting? So that's connectivity, guys. It's a very important option and a very close option as well, because whenever a risk occurs, it not only affects that vertical of the project, but it also affects multiple other verticals of the project as well. So we'll hold connectivity as well. Dormancy. So this option can be ruled out very easily because dormancy will be very low, because you know that this legal approval is now important because the new legislation has already been passed, right? So dormancy score will be very low because the risk has already occurred. Okay, so we can eliminate dormancy. Option D is controllability. Okay, so this means that how easy it is to control the risk, whether it is within your organization and you can control it very quickly and very easily, or it is outside your organization as well. Okay, now obviously it's outside your organization because this new legislation has been passed, but what is internal to your organization is the risk response, on how effectively you are able to respond to this risk. So you can hold controllability as one of the options as well. With the first iteration, we are left with A, B and D, guys. Okay, and we have eliminated option C. Now, if you have attended my Lighthall sessions in my first batch, we have talked this concept of data gathering before problem solving. Okay, so whenever a problem occurs, guys, and this is one of the frameworks that we'll talk more if you are attending my second batch of the Lighthall session. Okay, so effectively, whenever a risk is occurring or whenever an issue is occurring in your project, you should not jump into solving the problem without proper data gathering and data analysis. Okay, so that's very important, guys. The first step of solving any problem is data gathering and impact analysis. So it's very important. If as a project manager you are jumping into solving without data gathering, you are not a good project manager as per PMBOK. It's very important, guys. So if you know this framework, guys, it is very obvious and you can answer this question very easily. How? Connectivity, right? So what is connectivity? We talked that connectivity tries to establish, with this risk occurring in your project, which verticals of the project it's impacting. Okay, so essentially it's doing like a triple constraint analysis, and not only in the triple constraint, it's trying to analyze resources, trying to analyze risks on communication, etc., etc. So that's a part of data gathering, guys. That's how you understand that whenever a risk is occurring in your project, where all it's impacting. So if it is a low impact issue, risk response will be different. If it is a high impact issue, risk response will be very different. So it is important for you to understand how critical is the risk for your project. Okay, and that's a part of data gathering. So with that framework, if you assess this question, the obvious answer is option B, which is connectivity, because manageability and controllability are part of your risk response, guys. Okay, not your risk analysis. So after you have established the connectivity and you have like assigned a score in terms of how critical is the risk for your project, then you go into the discussion of how quickly you can manage it, how quickly you can control it, etc., etc. Okay, so that's why manageability and controllability is not the correct option, guys, because it's focusing more on the action part of the risk and not on the analysis and data gathering part of the risk. And as we go back to our framework, which we learned in our Lighthall class, and if you are joining my class next time, you will learn this as well, that whenever a issue or a problem occurs, the first step of the problem is data gathering. Okay, and connectivity syncs with that concept, that framework. So that's why the correct answer to this question is option B, which is connectivity. Okay, so if you are finding the session helpful, please press the like button and subscribe to this channel, PMP with Ray. It's surprising that more than 70% of you who watch these videos on this channel are not yet subscribed. Okay, so your support to help this channel grow will be highly appreciated. And now let's move on to the next one.
Right, so question number 3, guys. The drill will remain the same. Please read the question and try to answer it before we solve this together. You can pause the video here if you want to. Right, so let's get started. The burn down chart shows some story points as incomplete. Okay, now for that you need to understand what is a burn down chart, right? So please go back and study your Agile practice guide, or you can watch the videos on my YouTube channel as well, where I have discussed these topics of burn up and burn down charts. Please go back and study the previous month's Q&A sessions. Okay, so basically burn down charts are an Agile tool which gives you sort of a progress report in terms of the way you are progressing through a Agile sprint or a Agile iteration. Okay, it has a number of story points, and as you complete the story points, your chart actually burns down in terms of the story points that are remaining to be completed. It is basically a let's say a schedule tracking tool where your scope is your story points and your schedule is how many story points is left to complete. Okay, so that is basically a burn down chart. Okay, so here the burn down chart is showing that some story points are incomplete. Now this becomes apparent at the end of a sprint cycle. Now the sprint cycle has ended, and of course it has been found that the story points which were supposed to be completed in that sprint, it is not completed, or they are not completed. Let's say if there are multiple story points, and it is something of concern to the project manager. So multiple team members worked on the story points and no impediments were identified. So this is the funny bit that there were a lot of team members who were working on those story points, and they have not reported any kind of concerns or risk, etc., with respect to the execution or the completion of those story points. Okay, so how should the agile team tackle the situation? Okay, so that is the question. So let's look at the options one by one. Option A, which is to revisit the product backlog and add the story points in, then wait for a less intensive sprint to complete the same. Okay, now this is incorrect, guys. Okay, because if you wait for a less intensive sprint to take in these story points, what is the guarantee that these story points are not as intensive as the story points that you will be picking up in your future sprint, right? So there is no guarantee of that. Secondly, what makes you believe, or what is that data point that we have in this question which gives us confidence that it is okay to wait on these story points for the next sprint, next suitable sprint, let's say, to come up, right? So there is no sort of those kind of assumptions that we can take. These story points might be very important in terms of the foundational elements of a project that you are executing, right? So that is why it is sort of not okay to consider adding those story points in a later sprint, which you think might be less intensive, which can definitely not be the case when it comes to reality, right? So that is why option A is incorrect. Let's look at option B. Organize a spike to understand the complexity of the story points. Again, this is incorrect again, right? Because if the story points were complex, there would have been impediments or blockers that would have been called out in your stand-ups or in your daily sprint review meetings, right? And generally you do spike on a story point which is typically very complex, and typically you are not able to break the story point down into manageable chunks or manageable pieces, and that is why you organize a spike, which is sort of a brainstorming session to break down a complex story point into simple multiple story points. Okay, so this is also incorrect here, because as of now it has been mentioned in the question stem that there were no impediments or blockers or risks that were highlighted whilst the story points were not worked upon. Okay, so that is why option B is also incorrect. Let's look at option C. Proceed with the next sprint and document the incomplete story points in the sprint retrospective. Again, that is totally outrageous, guys, because sprint retrospective is not about documenting that, okay, we were not able to complete the scope. Okay, it is actually documenting that, okay, what were the learnings coming out of a sprint or iteration, etc., etc. Okay, so, and you can't just leave these story points out for the next sprint and start documenting that, okay, it is fine, we were not able to complete these story points, but that's okay, let's document it as a retrospective. That is not taken, right? Because as a project manager, you are expected that you will be completing the entire scope of the project or the sprint or the iteration that we are talking about. So that is why option C is also incorrect, and that leaves us with option D, which is the correct answer choice to this question, which is to break down the story points into smaller story points, okay, each with its definition of ready. And that makes perfect sense, because that might have been the case that this story point was, let's say, maybe simple. Okay, it was not very complex, but since it was such of a large scope that needed to be considered, because let's say story points are similar to WBS, right? Work breakdown structure. So if you have a very big work package, which is part of your work breakdown structure, ideally it needs broken down into sort of sub work packages, right? Similar with story point. So if you define a story point which looks simple, but it is like quite complex in terms of uh, execution as a single overall story point, you generally break it down into smaller story points. That doesn't need a spike to do that, but at least you need like something called as a decomposition, where you break down a WBS, or you break down a work package into your smaller WBSs, similar with the story points. And that might be one of the reason that nobody sort of highlighted it, because the story point looked simple in terms of execution, but the entire scope of it, okay, was quite huge to be executed in a single single sprint. That might be the reason that no impediment or risks were highlighted. Okay, so breaking it down into smaller story points might make sense, and that is why option D is the correct answer choice, with each of its the sub story points having the definition of ready. And now, what is definition of ready? Again, it's an agile term, so you can go back and study your agile practice guide. Basically, definition of ready is the scope that you are defining in terms of the way you are going to execute the story point from inception to completion. So it means that yes, you are ready with the overall scope of the story point which needs to be executed, and everyone in your team is on the same page in terms of the readiness of that story point to start executing it. Okay, and once it's executed, there is another thing which is called as a definition of done, right? So DOD, probably you have heard of that term. So definition of done is when I will say that the story point is complete, or the story point is sort of done in terms of the execution. So that is definition of done, right? So that's where the term done comes from. So it is a scope validation tool that if you're saying that your story point is complete and it is done, it is not only you who is saying it, but it is all of your team members and your stakeholders are also on the same page in terms of what is a definition of ready and what is definition of done. So homework, guys, please go back and study these terms such as, let's say, burn down charts, which we learned in this question. Study this term product backlog, study what is a spike, what is a sprint, what is a retrospective. There are a lot of agile terms that we have considered or we have like discussed in this question. And of course, study what is the definition of ready and what is definition of done. Okay, so the correct answer to this question is option D. Right, so question number 4, guys, please read the question and try to answer it. You can pause the video here if you wish to. Right, so let's get started. A product development cycle is approximately 80% complete. Okay. However, the legal team has highlighted that some of the key elements which the product uses infringes on the copyright laws of the country. Okay, so basically a project governance scenario where you, as let's say the product owner here, you are into a product development cycle. That cycle is nearly 80% complete. Let's say a part of the feature, or let's say the full project, doesn't matter. Okay, as long as it is within the cycle of the product development, it is 80% complete. However, your legal team has come and highlighted that some of the key elements which you are using infringes copyright laws in the country you are located or in the country where the project is happening. Okay, what could be the appropriate way forward for the product owner? Okay, so let's look at the options one by one. Option A, perform a MVP or a minimum viable product. So you will get such kind of abbreviations in your PMP exam. These are very common abbreviations. Do not expect PMI to give you the explanation of such common abbreviations. Okay, so MVP is minimum viable product. Perform a minimum viable product analysis to identify minimum releasable features. Okay, you can say that this option looks like a reasonable option. That what I'll do is I will try to dissect the product feature and see that, okay, if I can eliminate the items which infringes the copyright and still can retain a minimum usable product, which I can show to the customer or which can help me to go to the next sprint or the next cycle. So basically, whether the product will still be functioning if I eliminate these kind of items which infringes the copyright laws. Okay, that is what the option is saying. Looks like a good option to me, but let's park this option here for now and look at the other options. Option B, redo the product development cycle, eliminating the element which infringes copyright. Okay, that is incorrect, guys. You can definitely redo that entire thing, but it is a not productive use of your time, or let's say the time of your product team, right? Because first, if you are not doing an assessment that how such kind of copyright issues is impacting your project, and you are directly going back to your initial phases of product development and starting everything afresh on a clean slate, you can do it, but you are missing a very critical step of assessing the impact of a risk or assessing the impact of an issue in this scenario, right? You have to do an assessment first before you take any step. Okay, I discussed this a lot in my 35 PDU class as well, that you need to do an assessment before you take an action. Okay, very important. However, option B is violating that principle, that it is not telling you to assess it first. It is just telling you to go back to the drawing board and start everything afresh, which is incorrect. Okay, so option B is out of the table. Option C is terminate the sprint cycle and disband the project team. This is incorrect, guys, right? I hope none of you have selected this option. So it is totally out of the blue, and basically it will question your authority or your credibility as the product owner. If you are disbanding a team or terminating a sprint cycle when an issue has happened, this is not something which is expected. So I hope none of us have selected this option. Let's look at option D. Perform pestle analysis to identify countries where the product does not violate applicable laws. Okay, so for that, you need to understand what is a pestle analysis, right? So please go back to your PMBOK 7th edition and read up the definition of pestle analysis. So basically what pestle analysis does is it basically classifies an issue, or let's say classifies a macroeconomic condition with respect to political, economical, sociological, technical, legislative, etc., etc. Okay, so it is a, let's say, risk assessment tool which you can do when a macroeconomic factor is happening in your project. Okay, now the tool is okay. This is, let's say, a factor which has happened in your project, let's say an issue which has happened in your project that you have, let's say, unknowingly infringed upon some copyright laws. But is this a macroeconomic factor? Probably not, right? So macroeconomic factors could be like taxation changes, could be like wars, okay, could be like floods, could be natural calamities, could be, let's say, elections. Okay, so these are macroeconomic changes. Now, to do a pestle analysis to identify countries where the product does not violate applicable laws can give you name of some countries, but you can't change the destination country of a product, right? So for example, you were developing a product on China, and you can't say that, okay, now since I have violated some copyright laws in China, I will launch the product in, let's say, India or in Japan or in United Kingdom, right? So this is totally a different population, different target group. So that's totally a random proposition, right? So that is why option D is incorrect. Okay. However, as a learning, please go back and study pestle analysis from your PMBOK 7th edition. Look at your appendix of the PMBOK 7th edition. It is arranged alphabetically. Pick up the term pestle analysis from that appendix. Go back and study the same from your PMBOK 7th edition. That's a homework for you. Okay. So that is why option D is incorrect. Option C is incorrect. Option B is incorrect. And the correct answer to this question is option A, which is to perform a minimum viable product analysis to identify the minimum releasable features. And I think that was something which we were discussing at the very beginning, that you eliminate those items which are infringing the copyright laws, or let's say you try to replace that and see that if you can use something which is non-copyrighted material just to replace that and still maintain that functionality, or let's say totally eliminate it and see that if the product is still working, and then go back to the customer with a minimum viable product, and then it gives you time to do a reassessment and find alternative options. Okay, so that is also something which is a pragmatic approach as a product owner when you are managing such a scenario. Okay, so the correct answer to this question is option A.
Right, so question number 5, guys. Read the question and try to solve it before we take this together. You can pause the video here if you wish to. Okay, so let's get started. A self-organizing Scrum team delivered exceptional results during the initial 4 sprints, but the product owner has observed declining velocity in the recent 5 sprints with no clear explanation. Okay, what could be the cause of this situation? Now, to answer this question correctly, you first need to understand these terms in terms of what constitutes a Scrum team. Okay, what is a sprint, what is a velocity. Okay, so if you are not aware of these agile terms, guys, I would recommend that you go back to your agile practice guide, or you can watch a few videos on my YouTube channel as well, where I have discussed these agile terms in detail. Okay, because to answer these kind of questions correctly, it is very important that you have a solid understanding in terms of what the key terms and terminologies of agile project management PMI would like you to know as a PMP exam candidate. So for example, we'll see that when we evaluate option B, we need to understand that what is a technical debt in terms of agile project management. Okay, so the key takeaway before we start solving the question is that as a PMP exam candidate, you need to have a pretty sound understanding in terms of the basics of agile project management. Okay, so with that, let's start solving the question. Option A. The team focused on simple user stories from the product backlog in the initial 4 sprints. Okay, this is a plausible option because if you think about it, that if the team prioritized, or let's say the team worked on some user stories which were very simple and easy to complete, the velocity of the team, which is, let's say, number of user stories completed in a particular sprint, okay, that's the measurement of velocity, that metric would be anyways higher because you are solving simple things, and when you are doing or executing simple things, you tend to do it much quicker rather than doing complex or challenging user stories, right? So that is a very, very sensible option which is there in option A. However, with respect to our analysis strategy, we will evaluate option B, C, and D and still try to understand what do they mean, and also if we are rejecting them, why we are rejecting them. Okay, so those are the things which we need to keep in mind before we pick or eliminate any answer choice. Okay, so let's look at option B. Technical debt have accumulated and the team's velocity will continue declining until the root cause is addressed. Now, if you are someone who does not have a good foundation on Agile, you will get enticed or let's say impressed with this kind of complex terminology that has been used in this option, right? So for example, technical debt, okay, team's velocity, okay, seems like this is the right option because it has like a lot of hoo-ha around it in terms of technical debt and team's velocity, etc., etc. But first you need to understand that what is a technical debt, right? So in Agile projects, technical debt, it refers to the extra work or cost that arises when teams take shortcuts or let's say makes any trade-offs in the code base or let's say in the story points which they are trying to complete to deliver the functionality faster. Okay, so these shortcuts might help to meet the goals in the short term, like let's say it can help you to meet the sprint deadlines, but they often lead to long-term issues such as maintainability, scalability, or performance. Okay, now in terms of the way the question has been sort of presented to you, it is nowhere mentioning in the scenario that the team has taken any shortcuts or let's say they have made any trade-offs in terms of delivering the functionality faster. Okay, so if you read the question stem very carefully, if something on those lines were present in the scenario, this could have been the correct answer choice. However, option B, on the surface it seems like a very good answer choice, but it is incorrect because within the question stem nowhere it has been mentioned or sort of hinted to that the team is making any trade-offs or the team is deliberately taking any shortcuts. Okay, and that is why the technical debt might arise in a standard Agile scenario. So the key characteristics of technical debt which you need to keep in mind, that sometimes technical debt can be a conscious decision that the product owner might say that okay, we will refactor this later, and as of now let's proceed with the base functionality, which is the minimum viable product. Okay, also you need to keep in mind that technical debt accumulates over time. So for example, like financial debt, if it is not paid off or not addressed, so it compounds and becomes harder to manage, right? So technical debt also becomes harder to manage if it is not something which is addressed very early. And the nice part about option B is if you understand technical debt in its entirety, you will know that technical debt impacts velocity as well. Okay, because as technical debt grows, it slows down future development because developers spend more time fixing bugs or navigating any messy sort of issues that has come up. Okay, now if you just links that, okay, I have read somewhere that technical debt impacts velocity and that is why this is also impacting velocity, because in the question stem it has been mentioned that it is a declining velocity, that is why option B is correct. It will be a incorrect sort of reasoning, because the base and the core assumption of a technical debt is that it is a shortcut or a trade-off which is consciously or sometimes unconsciously taken as well. But the core intent of the technical debt is it is needed to fast track any agile project to deliver the minimum viable product. Okay, now if that is not something that has been sort of expressed in the scenario, then the reasoning that the technical debt has actually caused a decline of the velocity is incorrect. Okay, so that reasoning doesn't stand. So that is why option B is incorrect. Let's look at option C. The team was in the forming phase of team development, has now progressed to the performing phase. Okay, so this is basically referring to the 5 phases of team development from Tuckman's ladder. Okay, it is like storming, norming, performing. Okay, so these kind of phases of Tuckman's team development. If you're not aware, please please go and study what are the 5 phases of team development according to the Tuckman's team ladder. Okay. However, in this scenario, there is no way it has been mentioned anywhere in the question stem that the team is in the forming phase or in the let's say storming phase or adjourning phase. Okay, so that is nowhere mentioned in the scenario. Okay, so that is why option C is also incorrect. And let's look at option D, that there is most likely a specific underperforming team member slowing the team down. This is again a very extraneous reasoning, because again, going back to the question stem, nowhere we can derive from this entire scenario that has been presented to us that there is a underperforming team member. Okay, so the correct answer to this question is option A, which is because the team focused on simple user stories from the product backlog in the initial 4 stages or the initial 4 sprints. That is why the execution has been quicker, but now since the challenging items are coming up in the user stories, execution has slowed down, which is very but natural. Okay, and that is why the correct answer to this question is option A. Option B is a very close answer choice, guys, but it is incorrect, primarily because of the reasoning of technical debt, as we have discussed, and because of the core reason that as per the scenario that has been presented to us, no way we can link technical debt as one of the root causes which is causing this decline in the velocity. Okay, so that is why option B is a very close answer choice, guys, but it's an incorrect answer choice. I hope you liked the video. Please press the like button and I'll see you again in the next one.